We are now officially launching this event. Excellencies, dear colleagues, good morning to who is with us at the International Environment House here in Geneva, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to who is with us on WebEx or is watching the video of this event. We have the pleasure to welcome you today for an event organized by Switzerland within the framework of the Geneva Environment Network, ahead of the 6th session of the United Nations Environment Assembly, which aims to take stock of recent publications referring to solar radiation modification. The event brings together stakeholders from different fields to provide their perspective on solar radiation modification governance. His Excellency Ambassador Felix Wertli, who is the Ambassador for the Environment of Switzerland, will chair this event. Before you are formally welcome, let me remind you that the documents presented, the summary, as well as a video of the event, will be made available on the webpage of this event. The link is available on the screen and in the chat for who is online. Throughout the event, those of you who are online can raise their questions by using the Q&A box. We have a dedicated session to answer these 2 times during this event. Finally, let me also add for those who are online that your screen, that at the bottom left of your screen, you have a tool which enables you to have access, to automated transcript in over 100 languages. So with that, Excellency, I let you formally open this event.
Thank you very much, Diana. Excellencies, colleagues, I'm very happy to welcome you all to the Gen briefing on perspectives on solar radiation modification governance. The recent assessment report of IPCC shows that we're not on path to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. In the current scenarios, there will be likely an overshoot. In the context of this potential overshoot, there's a growing discussion about potentially emergency options. And one of those options under consideration is solar radiation modification, a family of approaches that could potentially offset some climate change impacts. However, SRM also carries uncertainties and major risk of adverse impacts on food security, environment, global security, and also international cooperation. An additional risk of SRM is also that enhanced discussion could lead to decreasing efforts for mitigation and adaptation. And this in a moment where we have to be ambitious and to increase our current efforts. In this context, it is the view of Switzerland that it's very important that policymakers are informed what is happening in the field of SRM and have a possibility to consider if the current governance and also information frameworks are fit for purpose or if additional work on national, regional, or global level is required. And we have recently a number of reports that have been published regarding SRM. They look at the risks and challenges, and also some of them are very related to the governance questions. We thought therefore it would be a very timely moment to provide to some actors the opportunity to present their reports and findings and discuss them jointly from different perspectives. We have the chance today to listen to 4 presentations. They are all coming from recent reports. And the idea is that we have just 4 presentations, then we have a Q&A session to discuss them, to ask questions for clarification and some comments. But then to move to the second part, where we have stakeholders that present their views on what we have heard and on some guiding questions. I will then conclude by a broader discussion with all of the participants. I would also take the opportunity at this stage to thank the Geneva Environment Network for hosting this event and for all the presenters and discussants today for the availability. As we have a very tight program and a lot of important information that expects us, I would just, with no overdue, turn to the first presentation. The first presenter will be Andrea Hinwood. She's the Chief Scientist of the UN Environment Program, and she will make a presentation of the One Atmosphere report, a report that has recently been launched by UNEP. Andrea, you have the floor.
Thanks very much, Ambassador, and Excellencies, distinguished guests and colleagues. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, but I'm very glad to talk with you about UNEP's report, the One Atmosphere report. So if we can move to the first slide, that would be great. Next one on. Terrific. So as has already been outlined, we already know that we're warming too quickly, that we're not on track to meet the Paris targets, and that we require very fast action to reduce greenhouse gases to avoid this warming increase, which of course then has the flow-on effect to the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, such as the melting of the polar and glacial ice, sea level rise, among many other changes. And this is why this issue of solar radiation modification has come up. And I just want to make a note that often it's called geoengineering, but also climate altering technologies and measures. So we're tending to use solar radiation modification in one sense, but there are a whole group of technologies which actually could have an influence on the climate, but also other facets called climate altering technologies and measures. They are increasingly being scrutinized, discussed and debated because people are worried about the fact we're not doing enough to meet the Paris targets. And of course, debate on these possible technologies is polarized. Next slide, please. So what is solar radiation modification? They're effectively a group of technologies that aim to cool the planet. One of the key facets here that we must take into account when we talk about these technologies is that SRM does not reduce, remove, manage greenhouse gas emissions. So even if SRM worked to cool the planet, it still is not doing anything to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, which would then have subsequent impacts on the climate. In the report, the One Atmosphere report that UNEP put out, stratospheric aerosol injection is being studied and discussed primarily because it's where the most information exists, i.e. we know more about this particular technology compared with other technologies, and there are others being explored. Most of the research that has been done in terms of stratospheric aerosol injection is based on volcanic eruptions, which have actually shown that when those aerosols go up into the stratosphere, they can cool the planet within a fairly short period of time. All of the work that has been done on this sort of work, however, is modelling based. It's largely theoretical. And as I say, at the moment, the modelling studies suggest that deployment of aerosols could cool the planet, but there are a whole range of issues around how you would deploy, how much is needed, what are the subsequent effects. Next slide, please. So what do we know and what we don't know? And there's probably a lot more in the report, and I would encourage you to read it. There is very limited literature on uncertainties and risks. So this report was generated by 9 experts who came together across a range of areas from ecological, social impacts, as well as the atmospheric sciences. And what was very clear was that while there was lots of modelling work done on, as I say, stratospheric aerosol injection specifically, there was very limited information on the uncertainties and risks and impacts. There is certainly no international consensus on the risks of SRM. One of the other key facets out of the report was that if you deployed stratospheric aerosol injection, the cooling effects would diminish if you actually halted it very quickly. So think about it. You're still emitting greenhouse gases. You apply a technology to cool the planet a bit. Then you remove that technology. You've still got all those greenhouse gases that have been building up, and you have this potential for termination shock, i.e. big increase in temperatures and associated impacts. There are some suggestions. It could delay closing the ozone hole. It could have impacts on the warming of polar regions, cooling of the tropics. It's also seen as the slippery slope to deployment, i.e. research. So when does modelling become field experimentation, become deployment? This is one of the key issues around considerations of governance. These technologies are also seen as potentially influencing geopolitics. And this is because most of the work is actually happening in the global north. And we already know that developing countries in the global south are already deeply impacted by the changes in our climate, but they're also not being engaged at all in this area of development. And that's something that the panelists that we brought together felt was very important. Next slide, please. So some of the key concerns, of course, were the limited focus on potential environmental impacts, and this is why UNEP is interested in this. We have a mandate to keep the environment under review, and that includes technologies that could have a significant impact on the environment. That decisions about SRM and deployment would not be made in a globally inclusive, equitable and transparent manner. Why? The concerns about that because most of the research is occurring in the global north with little discussion with our participants in the global south. If someone deployed these technologies unilaterally, it would impact all of us. And I think these are the key considerations we need to start thinking about. SRM discussions could shift action from mitigating climate change to actually focusing on SRM. And of course, SRM does not solve the problem of greenhouse gas emissions and accelerated climate change. And therefore, we need to keep our eye on the prize, which is to reduce greenhouse gases and limit our warming. And of course, the other facet is that there is no governance over research, indoor experimentation, small scale or large scale deployment. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, there are a range of recommendations that are outlined in the report, but I want to make it very clear. The UN is not promoting research, but it is recognising that research is on foot, and we would be naive to think that it's going to cease all of a sudden. It's on foot. And in fact, I would say that there's increasing attention because we are not paying attention to climate change and mitigation and adaptation. But fundamentally, SRM does not solve the problem that we're experiencing. So we really need to be very mindful and keep our focus on that. SRM technologies are fraught with uncertainties and potential risks. And of course, we have these issues, complex issues of ethics and governance. And where do you actually place the lines of looking at ethics and governance with modelling studies? And then what is field studies? Is someone who's actually looking at measuring aerosols in the atmosphere. Is that deployment, or is that actually a way of actually detecting whether someone unilaterally deploys? A precautionary approach is always required, and I think our experience over history tells us that this issue will be no different to many of the others. That we're very firmly of the view, and the panel was very firmly of the view, and UNEP is firmly of the view, that we really need to bring a level of scientific discipline and evidence to the table to enable us to have a really good discussion about SRM. And that means that we understand who is doing what, where are they doing it, what type of research, what are the outputs, are they actually factoring in considerations of environment, social and economic impacts? Are they discussing this with researchers in the global south? So one of the key issues for UNEP is that we do believe there should be a comprehensive ongoing scientific review process to enable us to pick up research as it comes out, so that we understand what the implications of research that becomes deployment and then the potential for deployment down the track. I also think it's really important in this space to maintain neutrality, and that's why science in many ways is the safe space here. It is a very polarised debate. It's potentially distracting from action on climate change. So if we can actually have a very good, robust discussion that is neutral and that enables us to actually look at who's doing what, whether these technologies are even, financially feasible or not, is something that we could do in a global discussion, and that we certainly should start discussing what sort of form of governance framework, what would it look at? Would it consider small-scale experimentation? Is it only focused on deployment? Could we actually set up a register of those that are researching in this area, so that we consider some of the obligations that researchers have in terms of this field, where there is great uncertainty and risk, and where the impacts could be significant both for regions and globally? So with that, I'll finish off my remarks, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for this insightful overview and presentation. I think it was very helpful for us to hear again from you that this is a core mandate of UNEP to keep the environment under review. That's also the purpose why you have made this report. And also for reminding or informing us about the uncertainty and risk related to SRM, and also that there's very little information about. To also remind us that SRM is not a solution to combat climate change. Also about this discussion about what are the ethical questions, the critical question we have to ask ourselves, and what is the context, the framework when we want to do more research, what we have to consider. But also this basic understanding that we need more informations, in particular the Global South, about potential implication of the application of those technologies, but also to know what is going on in this field, who is doing what, this kind of mapping exercise. Thank you very much for that, Andrea. And I turn to our next speaker, that is Patricia Sanzal. She's head of research at the Polish Institute of International Affairs and other academic institutions. She's also a member of the advisory committee to the Human Rights Council. And with this role, she was the rapporteur for the report of the advisory committee called Impact of New Technologies Intended for Climate Protection of the Enjoyment of the Human Rights. We will hear from Patricia the report from the advisory committee regarding those new technologies. Patricia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Excellency. I just want to make sure that I am heard. Thank you.
Very well, loud and clear.
Thanks. So I'm Patricia Sasnal. I'm the rapporteur of a report of the Advisory Committee of the Human Rights Council on the impact of technologies intended for climate protection on the enjoyment of human rights. The Advisory Committee is a think tank, is supposed to be a think tank of the Human Rights Council, and we were mandated to prepare this report 2 years ago. It was just adopted. I am very happy to be here and thank you for the invitation. It's a privilege to be able to speak to you. I just want to say very briefly that in the report, we assess several geoengineering technologies' impact and risks in the physical sphere, political and ethical and social. We also assess their impact on specific human rights in specific groups, such as indigenous peoples, peasants, fisherfolks, and other rural people and frontline communities. We indicate the applicable normative framework, argue for a principled approach and a protective framework, including governance, inclusiveness in decision-making, ensuring accountability and oversight, access to information, participation and access to justice in environmental matters. We believe that a human rights-based approach helps to ensure that state policies are not regressive in human rights terms and can effectively improve the lives of all people, including through the realization of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. In the report, we assess the two broad kinds of geoengineering, that is carbon dioxide removal and solar geoengineering. So what I will now speak about concerns solar geoengineering and is taken from the report. I just take away the main premises and conclusions, but I invite you to look into all of the report. So I think I can take it further from nicely from what Andrea has just said, and by saying that some forms of solar radiation management, notably stratospheric aerosol injection, may result in regionally and globally unpredictable changes in hydrological patterns, harm to the ozone layer, dimming, reduced photosynthesis, crop growth changes, and further cascading risks in the social and political systems and relations, such as food shortage, migration, political conflict. Despite the presumed average global temperature decrease, all these risks would be amplified by the fact that once applied at scale, stratospheric aerosol injection could be irreversible and cause geographically uneven, potentially international conflict-provoking consequences, and would have to be continued to avoid the rapid and extensive warming after immediate cessation. So that's the termination shock that Andrea talked about. The social consequences would likely be uneven geographically, for example, through hydrological cycle disruption, which would potentially be harsher for poorer states, frontline communities, and the global south in general, depending on where certain technologies are used. That may in turn strengthen entrenched inequalities and deepen climate injustice. Also, in the social realm of risks, Surveys show that people worldwide are not familiar with geoengineering in general and solar geoengineering as well. That may result in increased distrust should a technology be used on a larger scale, fueling conspiracy theories in relation to geoengineering. Given the popularity of disinformation campaigns and their usage as tools of internal and international conflict, climate technologies may become their subject, in which case it may be increasingly difficult to conduct an informed public debate about these methods. That would add to the growing distrust of technology and science. Now, some forms of geoengineering, climate-related geoengineering, a general moratorium on it was introduced by the Convention on Biological Diversity in 2010, given the lack of transdisciplinary research. Hostile use of weather modification technologies is already prohibited under international law. Still, even peaceful use of such technologies could pose immense risks and result in negative human rights impacts. If climate becomes a tool a state can use against another state, such an action could radically change climate politics, making it a security issue. The use of solar radiation modification could bring about an unknown political and social order. Now, one of the risks, and this is an ethical risk that we underscore in the report, is the moral hazard risk, and I want to dwell on it for a little while. These technologies and solar geoengineering in particular can act as a deterrent to cutting emissions, which was already mentioned by the chair and the first speaker. It makes disastrous future scenarios more probable at the moment. A number of civil society organizations, indigenous peoples, and researchers, which we have consulted in writing the report, underscore that counting on technological solutions slows down reforms to cut emissions, including investing in renewables and the circular economy, and diverts public attention away from the primary goal, giving the primary goal being cutting emissions, of course, giving the false promise of a hypothetical future solution to a problem that requires immediate action now. Now, I want to underline this as the moral hazard risk is sometimes diminished. It is a complex phenomenon. We cannot assess with precision what impact it can have on people's decisions, on people's and governments' decisions. But since there is a possibility that it will deter both bottom-up and top-down changes in behavior and decision-making, it has to be taken seriously. Time and resources, all kinds of resources, financial and human, spent on one thing means that they will not be spent on another. Now, having said all this, the report points to the fact that solar geoengineering can potentially interfere with many fundamental rights: the right to life, to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, the right to information and public participation, the right to an adequate standard of living, and the right to food and water, as well as access to justice and remedies. It transgresses boundaries and puts obligations on future generations. I want to particularly highlight the right to free, prior, and informed consent of the indigenous peoples, which has been at least once, if not twice, violated when it comes to an attempt to have a field test in relation to solar geoengineering. So these cases have already occurred, and based on that, we also build our conclusions. Now, the two main conclusions that we draw in the report are the following. The precautionary principle has been and should be applied to geoengineering, also solar geoengineering. States have a general obligation to adopt legislative, administrative, judicial, and other measures to prevent harm to the environment at an early stage and to ensure that activities within their jurisdiction or control do not cause damage to the environment of other states or of areas beyond the limits of national jurisdiction. Solar geoengineering can interfere with the enjoyment of human rights and cause physical, political, and social risks to frontline communities, including indigenous peoples, and harm the environment. There is scientific uncertainty about the side effects, and there exist less risky alternatives. It is urgent to underscore that at present, the development of such technologies and policies to support them would not be in accordance with the protective standards of the human rights regime. Without an adequate protection framework, it is hard to envisage how technologies aimed at manipulating climate could be developed and used for the good of humankind. At this stage of their development, given the lack of sufficient knowledge of the risks and adverse impacts, it might be better to presume that geoengineering is generally harmful to human rights, and its deployment would be contrary to the existing obligations of states. Because of the moral hazard risk, these technologies limit emission cuts and systemic changes which are urgently needed now. We also recommend that states should adopt and implement restrictive regulations on solar radiation modification experiments where necessary, including a ban on outdoor experiments, while only allowing conditional and controlled research. The lack of a mechanism to prevent the development of harmful solar radiation modification techniques should be addressed in a manner that includes the Global South and climate vulnerable states and communities. Let me say, by way of a conclusion, that we believe that we do work in the risk framework. All action has risks and side effects. But in the risk framework, the risk of doing solar geoengineering is greater than that of not doing it. When it comes to governance at the current today, and with the current state of international affairs, ridden by conflicts, open conflicts, direct conflicts, indirect conflicts, it is almost impossible to come to a consensus when it comes to solar geoengineering, be it deployment or be it even research. States can in future, if they resort to using solar geoengineering, create a new political international environment and a large division into states, interventionist states and non-interventionist states, causing a new line of global division. I also want to underscore that there is that time is a factor. We have something like 20 years, maybe up to 30 years, when we know what needs to be done, and this is cutting emissions. Whatever is there that takes away the attention from the primary goal is not conducive to the human rights globally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia, for this presentation. I think it was quite interesting to hear that you have started by a human rights perspective, but the implications are really broad. It shows how broad this topic is, how many spheres are touched by it. It was also helpful to hear about the moral hazardous risks. So this, you elaborated much more about the impact of it, and also about the conclusion, the emphasis, the importance of the precautionary principle, also related to the risk framework, and the very clearly need for this governance discussion. This is also perspective that different states may act differently and have also different means and tools at hand, and also about the potential different impact of different parts of the population. I think also interestingly that there's quite a big overlap now in certain comments from your side with those from Andrea Hinwood from the UNEP report, that there's quite, there are really a number of those analyses from your side are quite similar to it. That also shows that there's a certain views are emerging if you look closer at those questions. Thank you for that. I will turn to the third speaker, that is Professor Anthony Patt. Mr. Patt is the lead of the Climate Policy Lab at the Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. He's also the coordinating lead author of the Working Group 3.6 assessment report from the IPCC. Anthony, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. I want to speak for a few minutes about the findings coming out of the IPCC report, how we structured the report, and what we looked at. Generally speaking, the results that we came to were very similar to those in the UNEP report that Andrea talked about. I think there may be a little less strong than what Patricia just talked about coming from the human rights perspective. And to some extent, it's worth bearing in mind that the IPCC is meant to be policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. So we very much stay away from making definitive statements about what policy should actually happen. I think it's also true, and one also needs to recognize that the space that we had to consider this within the IPCC report was far more limited, and the amount of time that we had to spend on it was far more limited than, for example, in the UNEP report. So in the initial scoping of the IPCC report, as you may know, there are three working groups. Working Group 1 focuses on climate science, Working Group 2 focuses on impacts and adaptation, and Working Group 3 focuses on climate mitigation. In the original scoping, it was decided that primarily this would be dealt with in Working Group 3, the mitigation working group, and indeed within the chapter that on international cooperation that I was the coordinating lead author of. In addition to that, there was a decision made to have a cross-working group box, which would be written by scientists from all three working groups, and then the same version of the box would appear in each of the three reports. Next slide. And we go to the, okay, actually, let's go here. So there we go. So this really shows how little space we had within the IPCC. So we had the cross-working group box, which was composed of 5 pages and dealt with a number of issues: the methods for solar radiation management or modification, the scenarios, the risks, public perception issues, ethics, and governance. And then in addition, within the Working Group 3 report only, we had a deeper dive into the governance. And across all of this, we're talking about 6.5 pages, so it's not a huge amount of space. Next slide, please. We, of course, looked at the fact that there were multiple methods for solar climate intervention. And next slide, please. And noticed as well that most of the research has focused on stratospheric aerosol injection, which is the one with global coverage. It is the most heavily researched and discussed. It is the one that has the most developed scenarios for implementation, and also the one where the analysis of risk, while very incomplete, has progressed the furthest. Next slide, please. The first thing to note is that there are multiple scenarios that people are talking about how SRM could be deployed. The most drastic deployment would be permanent use of scenario of SRM, where it would replace conventional mitigation. So if you didn't have SRM, you would have a temperature path that was continually rising. And if we wanted to constrain global average temperature rise to 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, we would have to have ever larger amounts of SRM. And while what we notice in the literature is pretty much universal agreement, consensus, that this is not an acceptable use of SRM, that the risks are simply too great if it's increasing in magnitude. We also note some opposition to permanent use of SRM, where it would augment conventional mitigation in a case where conventional mitigation led to a temperature overshoot, such as the lower graph here, the lower line, where conventional mitigation might lead to a 2-degree warming, and the intention was to use SRM to bring us down on a permanent basis to 1.5 degrees warming. Next slide, please. Most of the recent literature, and the literature which seems least controversial, is about using SRM in a peak shaving scenario. So if we had a period of temperature overshoot, the red line here, where for several decades we had warming in excess of 1.5 degrees, and then we're deploying very large-scale carbon dioxide removal to reduce atmospheric concentrations of CO2, you would nevertheless have many decades of temperature in excess of 1.5 degrees, and SRM could be used to limit some of that and to keep the temperature rise to something closer to 1.5 degrees. It would be initiated either in a planned manner or in response to some new threat. Its use would be limited to reduce the magnitude and the duration of warming in excess of 1.5 degrees, and it would be phased out after decades of negative emissions. And while the IPCC certainly has no recommendation to do this, we note that there are scenarios for this kind of deployment that do appear to reduce climate risks. Next slide, please. We also, of course, note a number of direct risks, and these are the physical impacts associated with its use. So these would be, during its deployment, the effects on the ozone layer, as Andrea already noted, potential for reduced crop productivity, effects on ecosystems, changes in the water cycle, and all of these, of course, would have effects on people. We note that there are very large uncertainties associated with all of them. The greater the magnitude of SRM that you would deploy, almost certainly the greater the magnitude of the risks that we would have to be dealing with. Next slide, please. There's also finally the other direct risk is the risk of a sudden warming from a sudden discontinuation of the SRM. So if it were deployed and then were to cease all at once, the temperature would rise rather rapidly, and this could also cause many of additional direct risks. Next slide, please. There are also indirect risks, and these are ones arising from the societal responses to the SRM use. And as we've heard, there's the moral hazard risk. The one which has been focused on the most is the moral hazard that conventional mitigation stops. So because we are using SRM or are thinking we may use SRM, the incentive to actually reduce emissions and get to net zero ends. The next moral hazard, and this is one which has yet to be assessed very much in the literature, is the moral hazard of negative emissions falling away. Because in virtually all of the scenarios that get us to 1.5 degrees warming, we do have overshoot and then have multiple decades of carbon dioxide removal. And one could imagine that if, because of SRM deployment, we're holding temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, the incentive to engage in those negative emissions becomes lessened, and we just simply don't do it. And then we're in a situation where we need to continue using SRM if we want to limit temperature rise. And then finally, there's the indirect risk of interstate conflict associated with one or a number of states deploying SRM, which would be, as we heard in the last presentation, a violation of international law and would be perceived as a violation and could lead to a conflict situation, which raises the perceived need for strong governance before we even go down any of these pathways, if indeed we're wanting to go down them. Next slide, please. One of the things we notice about the polarization is there's a very wide range of attitudes right now, or a very wide range of beliefs and positions. From, on the one hand, making the decision now to never to use SRM, and if in that case, a governance we need would be a global non-use agreement, and at the other end of the spectrum, a decision now to plan to use it, which would then require agreements covering research and testing and coordination and governance. And then in between, which is where most of the literature is located, is the idea of preparing to use it if future events warrant it. And then we would need agreements covering research and testing, the conditions for its use, and the coordination and governance of its use. The current political status is that each of the three standpoints have support within NGO and scientific communities. No state has formally signaled support for any of the standpoints, although some had implicitly signaled support for the middle standpoint by proposing further research. Full disclosure, I have to say that I have signed a statement led by scientists which does support the middle standpoint. Next slide, please. We highlight in the report, and I'm getting near the end here, that there are some near-term objectives of global governance. And this slide comes from one of the papers that we focus on in particular within the report. And these objectives, as these authors suggest, are first, to guard against potential risks and harm from its deployment. Second, to enable appropriate research and development in the event that we would decide to use it. Third, to foster transparency to legitimize future decisions. And fourth, to ensure that SRM is only one part of a broader policy portfolio. These same authors, next slide, please, propose a number of immediate interventions that one could make. And one would be to develop a transparency mechanism. So this would be about scientific and technical information, project development and legal compliance, funding sources and use. So it is clear who is doing what. The second would be to establish a global forum, namely a venue for dialogue between states, non-states, and multilateral organizations, leading to potential agreements, whether for non-use, potential use, or use. And third, incorporate SRM into the global stocktake under Paris to provide guidance into the fit between SRM and other Paris objectives and mechanisms. Next slide, please. So these are my final concluding thoughts, and these are mine as a scientist, what I observe having worked within the IPCC. First, SRM is highly politicized, and its various dimensions overlap with sharp ideologically driven perspectives and principles. For scientists, there are strong perceived risks associated with saying anything about SRM governance due to the likelihood of being seen as engaged in advocacy. And third, it might be good to normalize discussions of SRM governance sooner rather than later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anthony, for this presentation. I think it's really interesting to hear your starting comments about how short the part of SRM in the released IPCC report was. I think it was quite short, that is right, but also quite impactful because IPCC has such a great and important standing. It was also interesting to hear from you very concrete kind of policy options, and I would very much agree also with your conclusions that the discussion around SRM governance is very sensitive, very sensible, and also very politicized. And we heard your call for a more fact-based discussion that perhaps also then more outline the very concrete needs. I think that is also quite in line what we said at the very beginning, that the first step to have such kind of a discussion is to have access to information, to know what is happening, who is doing what. That was also called, that we heard, for example, at the very beginning by Andrea. With that, I will turn over to our next speaker. This is Pascal Lamy. He is very well known in Geneva for sure for his role as former Director General of the WTO. But in his long career, he has done very different things, very important mandates. Today, he's joining us as Chair of the Climate Overshoot Commission and Vice President of the Paris Peace Forum. The Overshoot Commission has recently published a report on this issue, and we're looking forward to hear from you, Mr. Lamy, some of the insights from this report. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I hope you can hear me. I'm not sure you can see me.
We can hear you, but not see you yet.
Okay, so I'll try to activate my camera, but I do not think it works on your side. It did work on my side when I did the tests some time ago, but never mind. I have also a few slides. If we can see the first one, which is just about the Climate Overshoot Commission, which, as you just said, Mr. Chairman, has recently issued recommendations. We are now on the second slide, which is a very short presentation of this Climate Overshoot Commission, which I had the privilege to chair, which was established by the Paris Peace Forum, and which was and still is composed of a variety of independent people, having to report to no specific institution, no scientific, no political obedience. So we are totally independent and multi-continental. We have members coming from the 5 continents and from a variety of experiences or scientific or climate expertise, and the Commission was backed by a rather strong scientific secretariat. So today is about SRM, and we will go to the next slide, which is our recommendations on SRM, which after having heard both Andrea Hinwood and Anthony Pat, I must say, are very much within the same mind frame. And this is true as well for the evaluation of the risks of solar radiation modification methodologies, and there are a few which you can see on this slide, as on the other side, the possible benefits. The risks are very clear, and the benefits for the moment are less clear, but we take the view, and this is the thrust of our recommendations, and again, very much in line with what we just heard from Andrea and Anthony, a sort of middle way, where we believe we should link very closely governance of research on SRM and governance of possible recourse to some kinds of experimentations. The main thrust of our recommendation is about a moratorium on the deployment of solar radiation modification. And the criteria which we use is a moratorium on experiments which would entail a risk of transboundary harm, which is a category which is already recognized in international law. Our recommendation is not that we should negotiate the terms of a global moratorium. Our recommendation is that sovereigns, nation states, should individually, unilaterally enter into this moratorium. The first ones to do that would, of course, put pressure on the possible followers with a large and possibly institutionalized international governance dialogue on this. On research, we make a series of recommendations, in the detail of which I do not have the time to enter, but which basically is about ensuring transparency, sharing, north-south equilibrium between both researchers and the discussions entailed by this research, transparency of funding of this research, so that suspicions that this would be financed for other purposes would be cleared. And we believe also, and that's a recommendation which, again, is very much in line with what we've heard so far, that this research should be evaluated globally, independently, and with a maximum of public involvement, including from stakeholders. So this is the thrust of what we propose. Next, move to next slide, just to recall that the Climate Overshoot Commission was not a commission on solar radiation modification. The Climate Overshoot Commission is a commission, the purpose of which is to review options in the likelihood that we overshoot 1.5. We do not say that this is inevitable. We say the contrary. This is not inevitable, but the risks of overshooting are increasing every day, given where we are in addressing the huge challenge of global warming. And what we've done in this report, which was published a few weeks ago in New York, and which I will hand over to the UN Secretary General 2 weeks from now, is a whole review of what we call the CARE agenda: cut emissions, adapt, remove carbon, and explore solar radiation modification. And the CARE agenda is an agenda where C comes before A, which comes before R, which comes before E. So exploring solar radiation modification with a sort of user's notice, and again, it's much more detailed in the report than what I'm quickly presenting for the moment. Solar radiation modification is not something that addresses the root cause of global warming, which is carbon dioxide emissions. It's a sort of last resort sort of patch in case. And I want to make this extremely clear because rightly, part of this ideological debate, which has already been mentioned on solar radiation modification, stems from one criticism, which is that this would entail a risk of distracting attention from what really needs to be done. And we repeat, and we, by the way, make also detailed recommendations on how to increase the speed of cutting emission, how to enlarge and finance and measure adaptation, how carbon removal should be handled, including considering, for instance, take-back obligations. And again, the recommendations we make on solar radiation modification are only one part of a much larger agenda, which we believe is really, really absolutely necessary now. And our hope is that this will trigger the necessary attention and help ramping up action against global warming. Final slide, just to conclude on a note of a recommendation. And I've been thinking about this in preparing this very short intervention with my Swiss friends. Why not consider that Switzerland would be the first of the countries on this planet in adopting a unilateral ban, moratorium on specific experiments on solar radiation modification, and we stand ready to help our Swiss friends drafting what such a declaration should look like. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and also thank you very much for this last suggestion, also the proposal to assist us. I think that is really the heart of the debate, no? To what extent do we have to work in a unilateral, national level? To what extent do we have to address those issues on a more global, multilateral level? It got very interesting how you set the scene a bit to put this discussion in the context of a general overshoot scenario. And again, also reminding us of the risk and also to make the link to the moral hazard debate question. That also is one of the reasons why this discussion is so ideologically strongly shown. Perhaps to launch discussion, I would just build up on the last point that you have made, Mr. Lamy. And we have next February will be the United Nations Environment Assembly. It will be held in Nairobi, and the UNEA is the world's highest decision-making body for matters related to the environment. And I think what you have all mentioned in your presentations, that we need a stronger dialogue on SRM, and also I think several of you have outlined that your findings in your reports are to some extent, to a good extent, quite close to finding of the other reports. So my initial question to the four of you would be, do you have any expectations for the UNEA next year? Do you think that UNEA should take up this topic? And should UNEA take any decision on this topic? What would be your recommendations? I know that also UNEP has published, you understand the ED of UNEP has published some thoughts about UNEA 6, and perhaps I turn first to Andrea with this question. Andrea Hinwood, from UNEP perspective, what are your expectations for UNEA 6 related to the SRM and its governance?
So as you know, Ambassador, I can't actually comment on what UNEA 6 and what member states would actually consider in terms of a resolution or action. What I can say is that I do think that there would be benefit in both pursuing scientific review of this topic that considers the broad array of issues that have been outlined in this fora, and that I think that whatever mechanism is developed, there is a need for that. And actually, Anthony put it very eloquently in terms of the transparency required, in terms of the research that is ongoing and that may extend. I think that is a very, very useful thing that should be put in place. And I think one of the key issues for me is engagement with the Global South. We are leaving out large parts of the globe and not engaging in a discussion on technologies that, should there be unilateral deployment, could actually impact all of us. So I think I would just reiterate that those are key issues for UNEP. I think they are issues for member states, but I say in terms of UNEA 6, I can't comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and also for outlining the neutrality of UNEP in this debate. I will turn to Patricia with the same question.
Thank you very much, Chair. To stay in line with the recommendations of our report, I would have to say that solar geoengineering discussions at the UN level should be ideally put on hold. But if they are not, it is of utmost importance that any talk is, one, transdisciplinary, and two, truly global. Transdisciplinary meaning that scientists and experts from all fields of sciences are included, because this has not been the case until now. More involvement of scientists in humanities, social sciences, political sciences, as well as stakeholders should be included in all of the discussions. And also, like Andrea said, the Global South should be included. And this is not an easy task because there are attempts to include people who come from the Global South, but it is, to my knowledge, not a genuine effort to really include their views in what comes out in literature. Now, the ideal situation to me would be that the scientific circles themselves decide in their own circle on the way forward, on how to go about research. And this is the question that we should be talking about, certainly not deployment. So when it comes to research governance, and there have been attempts already, I think the White House of the United States is working on governance of research on solar geoengineering. So I think it would be up for the scientists themselves to come to a sort of a global understanding on how to go about further research in this matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia, for this call to the scientific community to also show leadership in this debate. I think that is a good link to Anthony. Anthony, you have outlined also in your presentation that the scientific community doesn't share the same view. No, there are different views on that. What is your view, what UNEA should or could do next year?
Well, I mean, the IPCC can't offer any advice on what any body should do, and we really try to stay away from being policy prescriptive in any way, and indeed recommending the UNEA do or do not do something would be a bit intruding onto policy prescription. What I can say is that the literature we assess on the governance of SRM does have a lot of different viewpoints in it. And some, I think, would echo the thought that Patricia had, that ideally UNEP should not take up discussion of this because that could create risks, moral hazard risks, which should be larger than the things that it's actually able to achieve. On the other hand, there are viewpoints in the literature, and I need to stress this is not exactly scientific literature. It's people sitting and thinking hard in a more philosophical way. There are concerns raised in the literature that SRM could be deployed by a single state, by a non-state actor, or by a group of states or non-state actors, and that it would be good to have international discussions and international guidance on what to do in such situations before it actually happens. And that would then be an argument in favor of bringing it up at an international body such as UNEA right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, I would ask the same question to Pascal Lamy.
Yes, I don't have to take any institutional precaution, and I will give an answer which is the answer of somebody who's independent. And by the way, and I know I speak for my colleagues in the Climate Overshoot Commission in giving you my answer, because we've discussed that. I think the main point to make is that there needs to be a solid, science-based international discussion about solar radiation modification. It is too important to leave no stone unturned, given the urgency of actions against global warming. On the other side, we know that SRM is a risky option, and this has been developed by many. So we need an informed, urgent discussion about the pros, the cons, what to do. And there are a variety of recommendations on the table, including, by the way, the one we just tabled a few weeks ago in New York. Second, where should be this international discussion? Because it's all fine to say that we need a discussion, but if you don't say how to organize it, it probably won't go that far. UNEA is, according to us, for the moment, the remit which comes to mind. It does not mean that it can be the only one, but given what we know of the mandate of UNEP, given what has already taken place when discussions on UNEA started on this issue, and we know that there have been some in the past, we believe that this would be a very fit for purpose remit, although associating other international organizations, including within the UN system, such as the WMO, such as UNESCO, for instance, who, as some of you may know, the Ethical Science Committee of UNESCO is preparing a recommendation which probably will be published beginning of next year on the ethics of geoengineering science, and we've been discussing this with them. I think UNEA could be the place with input from other bits of the international system, whether on science or on governance. Over to you.
Thank you very much for this very frank and clear advice on this question. I'm turning to the room. If there are any questions or comments at this stage. Yes, I see one hand.
Yes, good morning to all of you, and a pleasure to be with you. My name is Jean-Pierre Raymond. I'm the head of 2050 Today, a governmental climate action organization. I would like to have a question to Mr. Lamy. Somehow I very much welcome and salute your recommendation to have a moratorium. But the way you have phrased it, you don't think it's a weak recommendation? Because first of all, you say it should be only on large-scale experiment. So who is going to define and how large scale is pretty difficult. Second, you recommend that it should be unilateral. So if a few countries do it, but the vast majority don't, how is it going to be relevant? And third, you propose also to expand research. So it means that even if you have a moratorium, you continue to imagine solutions. So at some point, it will somehow weaken the moratorium. So I will be glad to have your views on this somehow a different aspect in the same recommendation. On one side, a moratorium. On the other side, many options to weaken it? Thank you.
Yes, very good question, and which unsurprisingly connects with many discussions we've had within the Climate Overshoot Commission. Number one, expand research with a framework of rules, a sort of research governance users notice, which we propose in our recommendations. Second, as far as experiments are concerned, and we recommend research, and then we go to the question of what sort of risk should be addressed in deploying, even for experimental reasons, solar radiation modification. We propose what we call, for the general public, large scale, but the precise criterion which we propose to use and which is already recognized in international law is experiments entailing a risk of transboundary harm. And the notion of transboundary harm is already recognized. It's not just the country next door, it's also the high sea, which has no specific jurisdiction in terms of territorial occupation, or even space, by the way. So that's my second answer to your question. And a unilateral moratorium is, according to us, the quickest way to getting there. There is, of course, an option of saying, well, we will negotiate a global moratorium and we will have something that then a number of countries will enter into, whether it's a code, whether it's a treaty. We know it takes an awful lot of time. We believe it is urgent. And my experience in international governance, and I may be right or I may be wrong, is that if a series of countries start saying, these are the conditions under which I unilaterally adopt a moratorium in order to address the risks of deploying large scale, then if a number of countries does that, this will have a snowball effect. And the ball will be in the court of those who do not accept the moratorium, and not in the court of those who have entered, the first one which have entered into that. So we believe that in terms of international diplomatic governance dynamics, starting with a few countries that will then give a signal to others, is the right way to go if we want this to happen relatively quickly. And we believe it is urgent because there is always the risk. And we've seen recent fictions about this, which have been published notably by a rather famous Austrian writer who published a book in spring of this year, and the existence of which I came into very coincidentally. There are already scenarios which show that a country entering into a risky SRM experiment may not be just fiction. Over to you.
Thank you very much for this response. I have one more question from the floor, then we have two questions from the chat. Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm Francesca Ingrone with the Center for International Environmental Law. Thank you for convening this space. It's very important to have these conversations with a wide range of actors. Maybe a comment just to echo what has been said by Patricia Sasnal, really the importance of putting human rights lenses in the debate, because we're seeing across all these presentations the dire impacts and huge risks that deployment of solar radiation modification technologies would imply. And when, of course, we talk about potential ecosystem collapses, termination shocks, and so on, we shall not forget the human face of it. And this is really what the human rights framework and a human rights-based approach provides. And that's why the report of the advisory committee is so essential, because it's really the first one that addresses the question of geoengineering from a human rights perspective. And so identifies not just, of course, what the risks are, substantial risks in terms of human rights protection, but also procedural risks. A big part of the report looks at the issue of consultation, of meaningful participation. We see already that many experiments are being conducted with no consultation or participation of indigenous peoples, for instance, on whose lands these experiments are conducted. And really also the question of meaningful participation of global South actors. So really having this report, but also more and more mechanisms in the human rights field addressing these questions. We have the Committee of the Rights of the Child, for instance, also mentioned the risks associated to human rights impacts of geoengineering technologies. We heard from the Special Rapporteur on the Environment, the Special Rapporteur on Toxic, and so on. So really, let's not forget also to include these actors in the debate. Another comment I would like to have in reaction of what we've discussed between the difference between experimentation and deployment. This is a very fine line because, of course, if you think, for instance, of stratospheric aerosol injection, to have meaningful experiments that would allow us to collect enough data, we're talking about experiments at very large scale. And so what is the difference between these and actual deployment? So really being conscious of the risks, also when talking about allowing experimentation. And finally, a question for Professor Pat. In his presentation, he outlined a number of recommendations and scenarios, just to understand that these information and these recommendations are not only taken from the IPCC sixth assessment report, but also are part of his own understanding as a scientist, as a professor, because it wasn't very clear to me to what extent those recommendations were included in the Working Group 3 reports and what came out of his own professional thinking. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments or for the question. I think the question, as I understood it, he made it quite clear that he made also a distinction between what he did as an IPCC report, and he was very transparent now about his opinions as scientists. And I think he also showed that IPCC is policy, not policy prescriptive, so also the limit what they can recommend. I think in general terms, he has answered the question that you had, that there were different influences in his response to that. I'll just take up one last question that was put on the chat by Mr. Yves Lador. The question was, I read it out, Mr. Pascalami made a very relevant and precise proposal to Switzerland to take a lead at its national level. And then if I can provide some perspective on this. I just take up this question, and then the question that was posed mainly related to human rights by Monsieur Isatou Sarr. We will then take that up later at the discussion with the stakeholders. To the question of Mr. Yves Lador, I think Switzerland, we have, together with a number of co-sponsors, I think there are 12 co-sponsors in total, have submitted a resolution at UNEP 4 in 2019. And exactly the idea was that we said we need more information on what is happening in the field of SRM. At the time, we called it Climate Altering Technologies and Measures, CATM, so with a broader term. Because governments have to be able to consider actions on the national but also on the global level. And the first step to be able to have such discussion needs an enabled discussion and information. That means information has to be available. And secondly, also a main concern we have expressed at the discussion at the time was that it was the view of the co-sponsors, including Switzerland, that we want to prevent unilateral use. Now that would be a bit a different approach now, that would be kind of a unilateral approach to prevent a certain deployment of SRM. And I think what is still is in the room to be that governments are able, and that includes also for sure Switzerland, to consider such a proposal means that we need a full picture of it. We need to be able to access all the informations, to have an overview of what is exactly happening. Perhaps we need a mapping of existing governance frameworks and so on, so that we can also put such kind of action in a broader context. So for me, if we have the wished idea that governments consider such kind of proposals, that means we have to ensure that they have also access to a full picture. And I think in relation to that, the UN system will play a crucial role to enable governments to take such a kind of decisions. With that, I would then close this part of the presentations. And I would like to thank all the panelists, all the presenters for their very insightful and helpful informations. For me, it was I learned a lot, I have to admit. And what I said before, what struck me really, that was that many of the recommendations go together. For sure, there are differences on the perspective, how you looked at discussions. Not all recommendations are exactly the same, but I think all recommendations have a certain overlap. And that, I think, is for us, as from the policy side, a very interesting information. I will turn over to the stakeholder perspectives. We have different stakeholders here with us in the room and also online. And we have heard in the presentation the importance also to fully include the Global South from a scientific research perspective, but for sure also from a policy perspective. So I'm very happy to give the floor to Shaikh Silla. He is very well known in the international environmental governance discussion. He had different functions. For example, he was very active in the Montreal Protocol that also is a key player in the whole discussions. Mr. Silla is from Senegal and is the director of the Ministerial Cabinet for Environment and Sustainable Development. And I will turn over to you, Silla, for some considerations from your side.
Okay, thank you very much, Excellence Ambassador Felix. And thank you also, Switzerland, and the opportunity we have to talk about this very important subject for the world. I start this in 3 steps, and the first step is we have a study from some African expert and negotiator on climate to pose this debate on the problem, vulnerability, the element for positioning and refining Africa on geoengineering, especially on SRM issue for Africa. And this study allow us to have a workshop in Nairobi in early January 2022, and I will highlight the summary of the key message here. We have this hybrid format in Nairobi because that was just during the COVID or just after the COVID. Give us the opportunity to discuss with the participant and deeply concerned that current level of global ambition of commitment to address the global climate change crisis are insufficient and will not limit global average temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. And this will result in severe impact on the continent already extremely vulnerable and with the least capacity to adapt to climate impact. That the potential impact of SRM technology will add a further burden on a continent already experiencing climate change and in its impact. Next slide. And further, Africa is also extremely concerned that the focus on financing experimentation with and studies on this technology, largely in developed countries, will result in countries shying away from their UNFCCC obligation to implement and finance mainstream proven policies, technologies, and measures to achieve, first, the actual and real reduction of global GHG emission as sources, and building of resilience and adaptive capacity, particularly in developing countries. And additionally, Africa is concerned that the focus on negotiating a governance system for this emerging SRM technology will take time and potentially further divert political will and resource away from obligation to implement and finance proven policy, technologies, and measures under the UNFCCC framework. Next slide. In the light of this concern and high degrees of uncertainty around this technology, Africa should not support their application at this stage, but should rather support the development of an authoritative scientific synthesis and review of the state of knowledge of these technologies, assessment of their potential benefits, cost, risk, impacts, and other implications possible. The scientific assessment should be conducted by a mandated body such as the IPCC or UNESCO, with a view to informing any possible international policy debate on science and risk-based international management of potential implications if necessary. Africa is further concerned that the SRM technology, first in terms of the current state of knowledge, will have potentially several transboundary impacts and implications across multiple sectors and areas of legal jurisdiction. Given the global and transboundary nature of these potential impacts, it is important for any concern related to the technology to be considered by relevant mandated bodies within the UN system involving all African countries and the African Ministerial Environment Conference at scientific, technical, administrative, political, and legal levels. While recognizing the importance of international control to prevent unilateral advancement of SRM technologies, and that ensures African concerns are fully addressed, pending and noteworthy review of the current state of knowledge of these technologies, as well as the need for further capacity building and consolidation. Africa is not yet also, again, ready to support any engagement on possible broader international governance matter related to this technology, given the above mentioned. First, the limit level of understanding, and the considering that existing bodies within the UN system have the mandate to address any immediate geoengineering concern that may arise. The African Group of Negotiation on Climate will develop further consideration and report to the African Ministerial Conference on Environment for decision making. I think that this end may present the second step. And in the last step, the SRM aim to increase albedo and many other things we know, but we are in the uncertainty. And what stage are we in conceptual proposal and preliminary laboratory research, in implementation? We don't know exactly where we are. And combined with mainstream mitigation and adaptation measures, geoengineering has potential to significantly ameliorate climate change impact, maybe. Distinguished from CDR may require also a different treatment. And today, we don't have yet from the African Group of Negotiators a report on that to be submitted to the Ministry of Environment. And maybe in the next conference of this minister, we will come back with some recommendation asking to put this in where we have the legality to do the job. And to respond to go to the question that was posed, I hope that we will not pose it again. We need like UNEP to take up this matter seriously and to have some clear indication for all countries in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sheikh Sila, for this very clear outline and this policy perspective also from an African view. And also the clear indication of what you expect from UNEP next year. I will hand over to the next speaker. That's Madame Marie-Valentine Florin. She's Secretary General of the International Risk Governance Council Foundation Institution of the Federal Institute of Technology in Lausanne. Madame Florin, she was ahead of her time. She already published a report on geoengineering, climate-altered technology measures and governance back in 2020, if I'm not mistaken. And she has worked a lot on this kind of questions, so happy to pass the floor to you.
Thank you very much for inviting me today. Actually, the first report we published and I coordinated with the International Risk Governance Council was in 2009. And that report was about SRM. And the title of the report is Cooling the Earth Through SRM, the Need for Research and an Approach to its Governance. And then following the proposed resolution to UNEP in 2019, we indeed produced for the Swiss federal government this report on, which is a kind of compendium, a resource guide on the range, the range of issues which are related to climate engineering, both technical, governance, there's a landscape of what exists, what are the ongoing discussions at the international level, and with two concluding chapters about possible options for the governance of research and the governance of deployment. My personal statement at this stage is that it's a kind of opening statement. Given the current climate change, it would be a mistake not to do research on SRM, and in particular on SAI, stratospheric aerosol injections. Research on technical possibilities, the potentials, the risks, and the uncertainties, and research on the governance of the research and the deployment. I would even be stronger. I would say it would be a big mistake to deliberately choose to remain ignorant. Ignorance is never something that makes humanity progress. And it should be possible to allocate public funding to research, because this is what makes research more transparent and available to all. And this is needed to support decision-based solutions. Although it may be the case that we will never be able to provide enough scientific evidence to support the decisions. So it should be possible for national research agencies to allocate funding to SRM research without appearing as supporting deployment. This is why this combination of supporting research and perhaps a moratorium on deployment is a right approach to that. Now, since 2020, we've produced a number of opinion pieces. So these are opinions, based on facts, but opinions. And in particular, the need to support or to adopt a portfolio approach to climate change reduction, prevention, emission reductions, carbon dioxide removal, adaptation, which must be developed simultaneously in parallel, and consider solar radiation management. Only consider, but this is a portfolio. We probably need everything. Then there is also the problem of trade-offs that are conflicting objectives. It is not possible to achieve all our objectives, and especially when we compare the risks of climate change and the risks of SRM. We know thousands of people have very probably died directly from consequences of climate change, and millions of people will die in the years to come. So this is a serious threat that requires a serious and perhaps different approach to options to mitigate the problem than our kind of politically neutral way of approaching many technical problems. One of the last pieces we've produced is a framework to help decide about SAI deployment. So if and when sufficient knowledge has been acquired, and if it seems that the benefits of deploying SAI in particular would be greater than the risks, or that the risks are acceptable. And so this framework proposes a set of conditions to deploy SAI, but it focuses on if and when we know in advance that it should be stopped. So basically, we should not, this is in theory, of course, but basically we should never start SAI without knowing that it can be stopped. And more precisely, the framework suggests that a time to start would depend on we are close to crossing one or more dangerous ecological thresholds. This is the first conditions to start deployment, if and when research proves that the risks are acceptable, of course. Second condition is that we are quite sure that we are on the path to sufficient CO2 emission reductions globally. And the third condition for starting SAI deployment would be that there is clarity as to when SAI can be stopped. And then, so therefore, it means that when we start, we know that we can stop it. You know, we know that we can phase out SAI in order to avoid a termination shock. So the time when it should be stopped is first, this time can be identified before we start. This is a bit of a paradox, but we need to identify before we start that it can be stopped. Second, emissions continue to be reduced. This is absolutely crucial. And third, large-scale carbon dioxide removal to reduce atmospheric concentration has been implemented effectively. So these are kind of opinions about this very difficult question. But to finish, I would like to suggest one analogy. That is the analogy with medicine. In medicine, there are three very useful principles. The first is that there is a duty to do everything is possible to help a patient. We have a duty to help reduce illness and diseases as much as possible. The second thing is the kind of gold standard for risk and safety assessment. That is the famous three-stage clinical trials. You first assess the safety of a technique, the treatment. You second assess the efficacy of that treatment. And third, you assess whether the new treatment is better than the existing treatment. And following that, we have adopted, and for many years, all countries in the world have adopted a very acceptable framework for successfully improving people's health. And the third element of the analogy with medicine is that, as you know, as we all have experienced quite often, the closer a patient is in pain, and the more acceptable a difficult treatment would be to that person. So in other words, patients who are very close, who suffer a lot, with a lot of pain, and with very little hopes for cure, are willing to accept a treatment with lots of side effects. I'm just suggesting this analogy because I think that it's useful to compare SRM with other technologies to find solutions that maybe we are not familiar with in the climate domain. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Flora, for those thoughts. It's very interesting, the very concrete scenario for an SIE, and also this idea of a framework, how you could enable research when you have in the same time a moratorium for deployment to provide this kind of safety and clear context. With that, I will turn to our third panelists. It is Ms. Lily Four. She's Director of the Fossil Economy Program at the Center for International Environmental Law, CIEL. Lily, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, and greetings from Berlin, Germany. Thank you for this invitation. So I'll dive right in since I just have a few minutes. I'll have a starting point, and then I'll leave a few comments. I want to share a few comments about each of the reports that have been presented here in this meeting, and have some concluding thoughts and remarks. So my starting point is twofold. One is, yes, the IPCC made it clear we're not on track, but they also make clear that proven and readily available solutions exist and that they can be rolled out. So they refer to phasing out fossil fuels, to renewable energies, and also to reducing energy and resource demand. That is actually an important new focus in the 6th assessment report, which includes changing our consumption and production and also our diets. And the IPCC made it clear solar geoengineering is not a solution. Actually, I would like to quote Jim Skee, who in a webinar shortly after the release of the summary for policymakers shared that many of the authors couldn't bear to use the word solar radiation management and insisted on calling it solar radiation modification because of their distaste for it. My second starting point is that solar geoengineering research and experiments are not happening in a legal vacuum. Others already referred to the CBD decision from 2010 that amounts to a de facto global moratorium that remains in place. I also want to recall that that decision was based on a full decade of assessments and deliberations. And also want to highlight that in the marine geoengineering space, which also has, solar geoengineering approaches being discussed and researched, the London Protocol and London Convention which currently already ban a carbon removal technology, ocean fertilization. But there are 101 governments forming the governing bodies of the London Protocol on Prevention just stated at the end of last week their intention to move to regulate 4 additional technologies, 2 of which are solar geoengineering in a similar manner. So we do have some governance and more is coming. When it comes to the reports, I'm surprised to hear so much agreement and it looks as though they're saying similar things. I actually think they don't. So for the advisory committee report, we really, as my colleague Francesca already said, we welcome this report and really applaud the advisory committee for their effort, and really want to highlight that this report is part of a whole range of recent reports and authoritative statements coming from human rights experts. And they all agree that solar geoengineering is incompatible with human rights, and pursuing it would violate states' obligations and also infringe on the rights of future generations. When it comes to the report that Andrea Hinwood presented, I want to recall that UNEP did not get a mandate at UNEA 4 to do an assessment. The Swiss resolution was withdrawn, as all of us know. I also want to share that the 2 lead authors who selected the other authors for this independent expert report, so Professor Caldera and Professor Govindasamy, are known to be supportive of solar radiation modification. Scientists critical of SRM are conspicuously missing from the report, and governance risks and challenges are inadequately addressed. So in light of this, proposing governance of potential large-scale operational deployment, in my view, is not only premature, but highly dangerous. And when it comes to the Overshoot Commission, that is a private initiative set up and advised by very prominent solar geoengineering proponents. It is, in our view, not an independent body and has faced actually severe criticism from within and publicly. We also think that the Commission's report is quite weak in its conclusions and has nothing new to add really when it comes to the core questions of phasing out fossil fuels, adaptation, or climate finance. So it's no surprise that the media picked up the solar geoengineering bit as the news. We welcome, of course, that the Commission expresses some degree of caution when it comes to SRM, but as also, one of the participants in this room has highlighted, with its proposal, the Commission risks undermining the existing de facto global moratorium in place at the CBD since 2010. And the reference to that is unhelpfully buried in a footnote in the Overshoot Commission report, because only including deployment and large-scale experiments leaves open dangerous loopholes for outdoor experiments that would fall outside of such a very poorly defined threshold. And I also really want to stress the point that my colleague Francesca made, that stratospheric aerosol injection, the technology most discussed here in this event, even according to its proponent, is in principle untestable. Any experiments that would give any meaningful information on the effect on the global climate would equal deployment in terms of scale and timeframes. So in conclusion, what does that mean for the discussion on solar geoengineering governance? I think many governments still remain highly uninformed about the issue, but some have taken a stance, including, to my knowledge, actually the African Ministers for the Environment, who just recently in a decision called for a global governance mechanism for non-use of SRM. Those with vested interests in more research and experimentations have a disproportionate influence when it comes to sharing their expertise and exerting their influence. And the biggest polluters have the least interest in transparency, oversight, and restrictive governance. So that means, in our view, transparency alone would likely provide more legitimacy for those wanting to pursue technology development and outdoor experimentation. And we just simply cannot afford to waste decades of energy and resources on a high-risk, untestable, ungovernable, hypothetical technology. Especially coming back to my very first point, when we know exactly what we can do today and what we know works, phasing out fossil fuels, accelerating renewable energy, and cutting emissions to zero. So I would welcome those interested in putting new options on the table or new tools in the toolbox, or whatever image you might want to use, or to get all hands on deck to do that for the major task at hand of phasing out fossil fuels, including by supporting a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty as a new initiative. And for SRM, more than 450 scientists, which to me expresses a pretty strong emerging scientific consensus, are calling for a non-use agreement. More governments should join them And as with other dangerous technologies like nuclear or chemical weapons, we just cannot afford to remain neutral or walk some kind of middle way, or certainly don't have time to wait for everyone to agree before setting a global precedent of precautionary and restrictive governance that can then pave the way for stronger multilateral agreements. So I actually think we know enough about solar geoengineering to say no today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those very clear views. I think you have reminded us that the IPCC report shows also a pathway how we can prevent overshooting by enhancing enough action on mitigation, and I think also adaptation for sure regarding the effects of it. You have also outlined the existing governance framework referring to the CBD Convention again and to the London Protocol. And you made also some remarks on the reports that have been presented today. I think Andrea Hinwood, in her introductory remarks, she also outlined the mandate of UNEP to keep the environment under review. But perhaps it would be helpful, Andrea, if you would like to react to the comments made by Lily Fuhr, just to explain a bit more about the background, why UNEP undertook the assessment, and perhaps also about the methodology, how you choose authors and writers for such kind of assessment, to show them how you work on that and what are your standards in selecting those.
Yeah, thank you, Felix, and thank you, Lily, too. And completely support action must be maintained on mitigating greenhouse gas emissions to actually improve climate change projections. I think the reality is, though, we're not acting quickly enough, and we do have solutions, and we should keep it. In terms of UNEP's report, UNEP has a mandate, as I said at the outset, to keep the environment under review. And actually, we produce around 200 reports a year on a whole variety of topics. Those might be new topics, they might be for a specific region or whatever. We don't actually have resolutions for everything that we produce. When this topic came up, it was because there were so many voices coming up, both pro and against SRM, and essentially we wanted to inform ourselves and the broader system as to what the issues were with solar radiation modification. In terms of the selection of authors, we had a really hard time because there are so many conflicts of interest in this space because of where funding comes from. I would absolutely dispute the speculation on the views of the co-chairs, and I would suggest that perhaps you might want to have another consideration on that. I can say that across the panel members, there were a broad range of views, and from completely opposed to those who were mildly supportive, and hence the report is what you have from a collection of experts in their fields contributing their scientific knowledge. And I think we need to be very careful when we speculate on whether people are pro or against, which is why I think we need to be very neutral in this discussion and use the evidence base to help us. That doesn't help this issue that we absolutely need to keep the foot on the pedal with respect to climate change, and no one is disputing that. The reality, though, is there is research and substantial funding on foot in various parts of the globe. And personally, I don't want to put my head in the sand and pretend that's not happening. I want to actually tackle it, understand it, and so that there are good decisions can be made by countries if they are faced with decision making in a particular arena. And I think that this is why these fora are so good to discuss the issues. And I think we should actually discuss it because it might mean we have an open, transparent, global conversation about it. And we do dismiss SRM and, we go forth and we actually solve the climate change problems. And we may well, in that process, find solutions that we have not identified so far. Anyway, I think that's it. Thanks. Thanks, Felix.
Thank you, Andrea, for those reactions. I think it was helpful also to get a bit the bigger picture on the assessment, how it was conducted. I know that Patricia has to leave very soon, and we have received several questions regarding the report by the advisory board of the Human Rights Council. So I would just take the opportunity for Patricia, before you have to leave, to transfer one of the questions that we got regarding your report and your intervention. The question is, how did the Human Rights Council report come to a conclusion that deploying SRM is higher than not doing it, given the limited knowledge we have now, and the risk framework is about comparing risk of doing and risk of not doing in a quickly warming world? And also a question added to that one, that different societies and cultures have different perception on risks. So is there not a need for a global discussion and consultations?
Thank you, Chair. I'm just noting the questions, understanding of risk. Yes, actually, I do not have to leave early. Thankfully, my other commitment was cancelled, but thank you for giving me the floor. I'll take the opportunity to speak then, and maybe also some final comments. So I also wanted to draw a little bit more on the divisions of opinion that were presented around the table today. I think the reports, as much as our report, the advisory committee report, is based on the IPCC, it is based what is out there on those 6.5 pages, and not on what was presented today. So I think that relates to what Francesca asked about, whereas it does not relate to the UNEP report because we do not really have time to engage with it. And I also think that there are differences of opinion and the aspects that we focus on, because our report purely focuses on the human rights-based perspective. And so I just want to reiterate that our report recommends a ban on outdoor experiments of solar geoengineering. So I don't think there should be any doubt about that. And also, by the way, we think the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty is in line with the human rights regime. As for the questions, yes, how did we come to the conclusion that, if I heard you correctly, deploying stratospheric aerosol injection is more risky than not doing it? I just want to make sure I understood.
Yes. So, how did the Human Rights Council report come to a conclusion that deploying SRM is higher than not doing it? I think that yes, I assume that the word risk is missing in the question. How did the Human Rights Council report come to a conclusion that deploying SRM is higher than not doing it? So I mean, given the limited knowledge that we have.
Right. So actually, that sentence is not included in the report. This is what I said here today, but it is certainly, what I said is certainly in line with what the report says. We know a little, but what we know, what we know is enough to come to a conclusion that it would be extremely dangerous to deploy solar stratospheric aerosol injection at a large scale. And this is common knowledge in literature today. And I hope my co-panelists will correct me if I'm wrong. Actually, all of them did say this. So it is absolutely uncontroversial to make this statement. Also, I want to say that often people who are in favor, to some extent, be it to a smaller or to a large extent, in favor of deploying in the future solar geoengineering, they base their opinion on what was written by Paul Crutzen, the Dutch chemist, Nobel laureate, who indeed did write in Nature that we should research and explore geoengineering, meaning mostly solar geoengineering, that is sulfur dioxide particles in the stratosphere. But Paul Crutzen, in 2014, this was a couple of years before he died, did say that he would not apply geoengineering. He was in favor of research going on, and he said that he's already surprised by how many pursue it as a research topic, but he said that he shared the fear that researching geoengineering would lead to an attitude that CO2 reductions can be postponed because sulfur injection technology will save us from dangerous climate change. That would be totally wrong, he said. We should definitely not count on geoengineering. So I guess I'm saying it just to underline that the moral hazard risk, and maybe that's a bad terminology. It shouldn't be called the moral hazard risk, but since it's there in the literature, it has a very ephemeral nature. I think we're sort of indulging in it, engaging in that risk right now as we speak. SRM is a relatively simple technology and a relatively cheap technology. Of course, to know more about it, it would require research. And who is to say in a critically thinking society with open minds to control or contract or limit research? No, research, indoor research, everyone can think freely and do research. Now, the question is about public money, about outdoor experiments. So just to make it short, I heard some noises, maybe you want to cut me, but we're not cooking yet. And while we're not cooking yet, the indulgence in thinking about a very risky and contrary to human rights solution is dangerous. All of our minds and resources should be on something else. That is my opinion. I can speak freely. What's in the report is in the report, but I just wanted to make that clear. And last thing about the understanding of a risk in the global south. Now, we can take it to the absurdity that as we sit around the table, we don't understand the word, I don't know, a risk the same way. The global south is a generic term, actually also very Eurocentric and also very colonial, because there are many different voices in the global south. There can be different opinions. So we don't know what the global south thinks until we hear those voices. The point now and the goal is to hear as many voices around the globe as possible, and not only us in the global north. Thank you.
Thank you very much also for this clear point of view. I think we have to clearly say that in your perception was also what Lily Four said before, we have enough information to take these principal decisions. We should not deploy, we should not have to invest in research, if I understood it correctly. And I think also we're always coming back to this question of this moral hazard. What are the risks if we discuss SRM in a larger sphere? How did that then also interact with efforts to mitigation? I think also it was you that have before said it would be very helpful to have a kind of a consensus among the scientific committee, that they could also this kind of advise the governments what to do. From the discussion so far, I don't have the impression there is a consensus among the scientific committee. Perhaps I'll just give the floor to Madame Florin about a bit of the statement, the question, do we know enough already? Do we have all the information to take these key decisions yet?
So I think that first we don't know enough. However, it is not the only domain in which we don't know enough, although we have to take decisions. So what we need is more inclusive deliberation, more inclusion in the process by which a decision can be made. Because I would like to remind there are two ways to elaborate legitimate decisions. The first is when the decision is based on sufficient science. This is normative evidence. And the second is when the process is legitimate. In other words, like in a democratic country where the citizens vote for certain things, it is legitimate despite the fact that it may be different from what another country would decide. And so I think the other thing is I believe that to some extent the context has changed. The decision context has changed. We are no longer before Paris Agreement. We are in the context where we know that current climate policies will not be enough. So it is wrong to stay within that framework that we can hope to reduce CO2 emissions and to reduce atmospheric concentration sufficiently to avoid the crossing of dangerous thresholds. We have to be realistic that we are not on the path to sufficient climate change and CO2 and greenhouse gas emission reduction. So the context has changed, and therefore the decision context for SRM is also changing. That's my final statement.
Thank you very much for that. I would also turn to Sheikh Silla with a further question. I think one of the topics we have raised several times today is the Global South. And we have also discussed the UNEP resolution back in 2019. And the co-sponsor, one argument that we had at the time was that we need a report by UNEP because we have to inform all governments. And we know that not all governments have the same access to scientific institutions. So not all have the same capabilities to command, to conduct studies, and so on. And in our view, it was that the UN system, one of the strengths of multilateral UN system, that they have the capabilities to involve scientists around the globe. I think the IPCC shows that there are ways to do that. And also that the UN per se, by definition, can take different perspectives. So that's why also we thought that UNEP would be the right fora to further look into these kind of topics. And with Sheikh Silla, we have a representative of the Global South here, although my reference to discussions in the African group is the AMSEN. So perhaps some views from your side, how can the Global South best be involved, and what you have heard from other panelists, speakers today, how you react to that.
Okay, thank you very much. I agree with Patricia that the Global South, the definition is somehow the one we don't understand well, and how you can compare the Global South to the Global North. We are not speaking usually to the Global North, but only to the Global South. What we have to do is SRM is to make sure that what are the implications of what we are doing, and we are not so clear on the implication. To make some application, I don't know, some operation on this SRM, not only have an impact on the temperature that we want to decrease in the global world, but the impact will be other than only emission reduction or temperature issue. We will have the issue of adaptation, the issue of all implications that can raise the flooding in some countries. We don't know about the rain, we don't know the consequences, and it's why we ask to have a global study on this to make sure that all the countries are involved, all stakeholders, because we are in the same world. The atmosphere don't have any border. We can have border in the land between countries, but in the atmosphere we don't have border. And any action we have to put in this atmosphere can have a large impact. So that I think is very for precautionary principle. It's better to do some studies and to make sure that everything is on track and everybody understands where we are and where we are going. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Our time is off. We have to close the meeting. It's also lunchtime. I have the feeling that the colleagues are quite hungry. I see some hands raised up, but because of the time is running out, I think we have to close now. I apologize for that, but people here in the room, they have a short time to discuss together also directly after this meeting. Those who have perhaps more questions online, they can also reach out to the Gen with those questions, and we can also transfer them then to the people who they refer to. From our side, it was a very rich discussion. I think it was very helpful to get this overview about these different reports that have been published. As mentioned, those who have conducted reports have different backgrounds. There were UN institutions, there were own initiatives, there were scientific initiatives behind, so different backgrounds. As mentioned before, we have also heard interpretations to what extent they come to same conclusions or quite different ones. We've also heard a number of interventions outlining from some that we have quite a lot of information already that should not prevent to take act regarding not using non-use agreements of SRM. We have had other views that say clearly we need more information, we need some research, perhaps also in a context of a framework where we would agree not to use those technologies, but continue research on that to get a better understanding. I think what was very common here was a strong call about the moral hazard problems, the moral hazard risk. And I think also it's a common understanding in this room, what I have heard, that any discussion about SRM should not reduce in no way or be used as an excuse to reduce efforts for mitigation and adaptation. I think that is really the basis for these discussions. And I can also say from a government perspective, we talk a lot about global south, global north, but such kind of discussions are not easy for nobody to gain a full understanding about the very complex technologies, discussion, the context. And from our side, we can always say that we are grateful for good reports on those issues. If they come from your institutions, for sure they have a special weight on that. And this is always very helpful in the elaborations also from our side to take the decisions that we need in this regard. So I would like to conclude by thanking again all the presenters and panelists for the discussion. I would like to thank the Gen for organizing this event and to all of you for participating, listening and sending in questions. I wish you a good day and see you next time. Thank you.